Here in FocusControls, we're going to take a look at all the different operations and features for controlling the focus. We'll start with the focus mode, which is pretty simple. Then we're going to look at the focus area, where there is a lot of options. And then there are a few more additional tools that I think you want to know about, and we'll do a few little demonstrations to show you how they work. So first off, the thing to know about working with Canon cameras is that the main on-off for focusing is on the side of the lens in the AF manual focus switch on the side of the lens. And so if something's not working right, that is the first thing that you should check, because if it's in manual focus, a lot of the features we're about to talk about will not work at all. So we're going to go ahead and leave this in autofocus for now, because that's the main topic we're going to go with, but we are going to talk a little bit about manual focus as well in here. First up is the focusing mode, and this is accessed through the multi-function button on the camera. You'll press the button to activate it, and then you can press the button again to select the different options in there. And what we want is the focusing mode, which is currently the middle of the modes in here. And we have two options. We have one shot and the servo mode. So let's go ahead and talk about what these two different modes do. In the one shot mode, the camera will seek focus and it will find a subject. And if it finds it, it's going to stay locked on and it's just going to stop focusing. With the servo mode, the camera will seek focus, and as soon as it finds it, it continues to follow it. And so if that subject is moving towards you or moving away from you, the lens will be adjusting at that point. And so this is what you want when you have subjects that are moving around, sports and action type figures. And so it's very important that it be able to track this movement. It's usually the first thing that I change when I go into an action environment, is I know they're moving, so I need to change the focusing system to fit that. With standard photography, simple photography if you will, stationary subjects, I usually leave the camera in one shot. And so it depends a little bit on how you like to have the camera set up. Some of that is changing nowadays with some of the new options that we're talking about in here. And so in the past, everybody was in one shot or in servo, and now there's a lot of cases where you can leave servo engaged more frequently because the camera has some other focusing options that we'll be talking about. Now the servo is once again movement towards you and away from you. And so when it's talking about moving left and right, that's the next subject we'll get to. Now we don't want to forget about manual focus. If you do want to manually focus, flip the switch over to MF and turn the focusing ring on the lens. There's a couple of helpful ways that the camera can aid you in focusing yourself, and we'll talk about those later on in this section. So for now, you press the multifunction button, and let's go ahead and do that right now. So with our camera, we press down the multifunction button on the top of the camera. We have been talking about ISO in the previous section. We press it down again. It's our drive mode. We'll get to that in the next section. And here is our one shot, and we can use the dial on the back of the camera to go back and forth, as well as this button here. And we can use the top front dial to change back and forth between these. And so one shot versus servo. So in the servo mode, let me pull out a little bit of a test here. We'll see if it focuses on this subject here in front of us and see if it can. I am going to have to make one other change real quick, and we're going to get to this in just a moment. But for right now, the servo mode, am I in servo? I am in servo. So we'll go ahead and focus and see if it tracks this subject back and forth. So now you can see that it's tracking that subject forward and back. And there's a limit. There's the limit. And so the servo mode is very good for tracking subjects that are moving around quite a bit. We're going to want to combine that feature with what we're going to talk about next as to subjects that are moving erratically from side to side in the frame. And this is where focus area comes into play. So the camera has several different focus areas that you can choose. And you first need to activate this all by pressing the AF point selection button on the back of the camera. It's got this little 5-point bracketed area, and that turns the whole thing on. From there, you can press the multifunction button to choose which area that you want. And from there, you can use the joystick to choose where you want that bracketed area in the frame. Let's take a look at these options and then we'll do a demonstration. So first up is the tracking mode. And there's a lot to talk about in here. We'll talk a little bit about it now and then more right after this section because there's lots to go into. So this is where the camera is looking for a subject. It instinctively wants to look for faces, but there's another section where you get to decide what type of faces, animal, human. But it's generally looking for the subject. It's often choosing what's closest to you. And it's a good general mode to be in, but it can be a little bit frustrating for the more advanced photographer because sometimes it's picking things that you wouldn't choose, and that's why you may want to be more specific about what you're choosing. Next up is the smallest area, which is Spot AF. This would be good if you want to focus on a very pinpoint area. If you're taking a portrait, for instance, and your camera is focusing on the nose or the face and you want it on the eyeball, you could choose a very small area like that. Now, kind of a good standard area that I like is the 1-point AF, and this is where you can be precise about where it's at. It's not very big, and so you can be really exacting where you put it, but it's not so small it's awkward to work with. The Spot AF can be so small it can be a little bit awkward and may not pick up if there's not enough contrast in the scene where that little area is. The next is Expand AF area, and this one is the same as 1-point AF with help from 4 nearby neighbors, which is very similar to the next one, Expand AF Around area, which is help from, how many is that? 8 of the nearby neighbors. And so this is good for subjects that either move around a little bit or have a little bit less contrast and detail on it for it to pick up on. From there, we have the Zone AF, which is one of my more favorite areas. It's just kind of a nice big box. It looks for anything in that box. It's a simple area that gives you a little bit of directional control rather than just choosing like the whole area, which is in the tracking one. We also have a large Zone AF. If you're going to be photographing, say, a person with the camera in a horizontal format, this could work out really well for that. Or you can choose a large wide box, which is just going to choose a nice wide area. Now, on any of these large zones, the camera is going to choose whatever is closest to you within those zones. And so if you're dealing with multiple subjects, you want to be either very careful about how you place the bracket over them, or maybe you should be using a smaller bracket. So it kind of depends a little bit. And so you're always trying to choose the right size bracket for the type of subjects that you shoot. And so be aware that we have lots of different choices in here, and you want to experiment with these to see how they work for the types of work that you are doing. Now, as far as the focusing system in general, Canon says it has 100% coverage. It clearly doesn't. It's like 98 or 97%. I don't know why they call it 100. It is virtually completely from top to bottom, but it's a little bit short on the sides. I'm not complaining about it. This is far better than we've had in the past, but I think it should be called 98%. There is technically 1,053 points. We've gotten to the point now that I don't even put brackets on there. It's pretty much just boxes everywhere over the screen that you can focus if you want. The camera is using a dual pixel CMOS system. This is something they developed a number of years ago. The pixels on the sensor itself are essentially kind of split in two. They can pick up information left and right, and there's some interesting things that the camera can do, but the main benefit to us photographers is that the cameras focus very quickly. It's amazingly good at doing this. And this is because when you compare two different sides of information, they have their pixels set up in a way that it helps determine distance information. So it helps the camera and the lens determine, do I want to focus away or closer? Where do I need to change the lens in order to get sharp focus? And so it is not only accurate, which is what most all mirrorless cameras are. They tend to be extremely accurate. It is also very fast. And so it's very good at being fast and accurate, which is exactly what you want. It's also very good under extremely low light conditions, all the way down to EV-6. All right, so back on the camera, let's go ahead and dive in and make some changes and play around with moving this focusing point around. So we hit this little AF point selection button up here, and then we hit the multifunction button. Now I know before we talked about multifunction being used for focusing areas and ISOs and some other things, but now it's just being used to change from one point to the other. And so if we want to choose a single point, we would do it here. While we can see all these controls along the bottom, we can move the focusing point around with the joystick. We can also, see how we can kind of chase it around? It allows us to move the dial all over the screen, except for the very edges over there. Or we can use the joystick. And so there's a lot of different options for adjusting it. Now, once you press the shutter release, it goes back to your standard exposure information, and this joystick no longer works, and multifunction goes back to its previous uses there. And so you have to activate this whole system by pressing the thumb button on the back of the camera. Now, the modes that I think are going to be the most useful are going to be this face tracking mode. I like the 1-point AF, that's very practical. I like the zone AF, which is good for a little bit larger subjects, and maybe for really erratic stuff, this wide area is not bad either. Now, one of the things I don't like is that if I am here with the 1-point AF and I want to come back over here, I can't just go left to get there. I have to press the multifunction button while it's activated to get all the way around over to the tracking mode there. So there is a way to customize that, as there is just about everything else on this camera. And so the multifunction button kind of goes in a left to right system. We can dive into the AF menu and change the AF method selection control and use the main dial. And so this is one of those areas where I tell you there's a shortcut, you can jump ahead. That's what we're going to do right now. So let's go ahead and quickly dive into the menu. We're going to go over to the autofocus menu, and we can switch tabs by turning this dial here. We want to go to AF number 4, and we want to do AF method selection control. Currently it's being done by the multifunction button. I want it to be done by the main dial. We'll press set. So now we've got the new mode in. So now when I press my focusing areas here, I can turn the dial and I can go left and right. Now I have much faster control. I don't have to go all the way around to get to my focusing points. And so this is one of those customizations that I like. It's personal. If you don't like it, don't set it. But I think it's an option that allows us to make a quicker setting change, which I think is important. All right, let's talk some more about this intelligent focus that the camera has, this face tracking mode. So we can choose what type of subject to detect. And so we have people, animals, and no priority. So no priority tends to just look for faces, and the other ones are kind of obvious. Now, there are some different brackets that you're going to see in here. You'll see a green bracket that it will turn when it has achieved focus. You'll see a white frame around subjects that are being recognized but haven't been focused on yet. And then if they're moving around, it'll be a blue frame. And you'll see this whether it works with people or with animals. And so here's your kind of key to the way some of those brackets are going to light up. So let's go ahead and turn some of this stuff on. We've got a human face. We have an animal face in here. Let's go into the menu, and we're going to first change subject to detect no priority, just to kind of see what it does. Now, under our focus areas, in order for this to work, we're going to move on over to the face tracking mode. Now, you'll also see there's an info on and off for the eyes, and we'll turn that off for right now. So if we zoom back, it doesn't really notice anything in here. It's just kind of picking up, there's a subject to focus up there. As we move in closer, it picks up on the face, okay? And so it's prioritizing the human over the cat. I don't know, what's wrong with this? Let's see if we don't show the human, does it pick up the cat? Yeah, it kind of does. It says that that's the most important part of that subject where it's focusing. It shows you those blue boxes where it has picked up. And so there's the most important part, and now it switches. And let's go ahead and switch into one shot just to see what that looks like. And so you can see those green brackets are coming up where it's focusing. It's not really picking up on the cat there. And so it's a little bit finicky. This is the whole intelligent focus. The camera is using its own intelligence on where to focus. And if you really wanted the cat, you could just put a point on it. But it's doing a pretty good job picking up faces. Let's go ahead and dive in and say specifically we're looking for people. So now it knows not to look for the animal. If there's nothing else, it might go for it, but as soon as there's a human face, it picks it up. Now, as you recall, there was the info button. We can turn on and off this eye detect. And that is the same as diving into the menu, coming down here to eye detection and hitting that to enable. So you can see now it's currently on. And so it's picking an eye to focus on. And if we don't like the eye that it's on, if it comes up with an arrow, I'm not getting it here. Sometimes it will come up with arrows and you can switch going from left eye to right eye in there. Now it doesn't pick up on the cat at all because it's designed for humans right now. If we dive back into the menu, come up and change it down to animals, she is still getting picked up there, but the animal is now getting picked up. Now let's go ahead and change our camera's focusing. Rather than one shot, let's change it into servo. So now it can track a subject moving around. And so it can move that, and it's got the blue box, which means it's locked on. Let's change it back to humans. And see how far back it'll hold it as we come back. And so it's picking it up even here with pretty wide angle. And if we want to try to get a little bit more tricky, we can put something out in front. And so now it thinks that that's our main subject. And it's so out of focus, it's not picking up. So we're going to have to adjust our focus. And so the intelligent focus, it's one of those things that when it works well for you, it is unbelievable. It does what you could never do in tracking a subject around the frame and can be very, very helpful. And there's a number of people who do portrait photography. This is going to work unbelievably well. If you're more of a creative type and you decide, well, I don't want to focus on the person, I want to focus on this other thing over here, and there's lots of people around, the camera's going to be jumping around and you might think it's crazy. So there's a wide variety of photographers, and some people are going to think this is the best feature ever, and there are some people that are never going to use it because it doesn't work for them. What I do encourage you to do is to give it a try, learn how the system works, play with some different settings on the camera, play with different setups that work, that are the type of things that you like to shoot, and see if it works for you. I do know that it is allowing people to focus on things that they have not been able to focus and track before in quite this way. And so it is very, very helpful. Now, just out of curiosity, the animal detection, how many animals does it do? Well, they say it does cats, dogs, and birds. And so I haven't actually been able to take this on extended trips at this point for a lot of animal photography, but I did just pull up a lot of animals on screen to see if it could recognize images on screen. And so far, I have got the following list of animals that it seems to be able to pick up on. So dogs, cats, birds, yep, got those. Those are very easy. Horse, goat, monkey, elephant, rabbit, raccoon, penguin, beaver, buffalo, donkey, elk, wolf, fox, ostrich, orangutan, rhinoceros, wallaby, lions, tigers, and bears. Oh my. Coyotes, otters, lizard, warthog, gazelle, macaque, topi, lemur, viscacha, fusa, nutria, and squirrel. It does an amazing job at being able to pick all those up. And I bet you there's a whole bunch more that it's going to be able to do as well. So encourage you to try that out there as well, all you wildlife photographers. So the eye detection on this was something that you could turn on and off. I showed you that in the menu system. You can also do that with the info button in there. And that's a great way of choosing to make sure that you have the correct eye in focus. Generally speaking, when you're shooting portraits, you want to have the closest eye in focus. All right. One of the ways that a lot of advanced photographers like to set their camera up is with something called back button focusing. On the back of this camera, we have a button called the AF on button, and this is used, obviously, when you want to turn the autofocus on. Now, that button, out of the box, doesn't do you any good, because when you press that button for focus, and then you press the shutter release button, the camera refocuses pressing the shutter release. I mean, it's nice if you just want to see where the focus is going to go. But if you want to set the camera up in back button focusing, there's a thing you need to do. And what that thing is you need to go into the Customize menus, make sure that the AF on button is indeed in the AF on position. And then you need to go up to the shutter release button and you need to turn off the camera from focusing with the shutter release, because normally when you press down halfway on the shutter release, it focuses. And in order to do back button focusing, you need to make this change. So let's go ahead and make this change right now for all of you who do want back button focusing. So we go menu. We're going to dial over to the custom setting, this camera with the little notches below it. Now we're going to need to go to the correct page, and page we want is page 3 and the third item down. So we're going to be coming back here a lot, so remember this place. Customize buttons. Now all these different buttons down here go through all the different features, and we're going to talk about a lot of these. But first page of this is right here, and AF on button is currently set to metering and autofocusing when we press down on the AF on button, which is perfect, exactly what we want. Now up here on the top, the shutter release button is for metering and autofocus, and we don't want that. So we're going to press in on that and we're going to turn metering. That's fine, we'll do metering and have that set. Now our camera is in back button focus. So the idea with back button focus, let's go ahead and set up a foreground subject. I'm going to switch focusing points just so that I can have a little bit more control over things. Actually, I forgot I changed this to the dial. I just want a single point. So the idea with back button focusing is I could choose to focus on a subject, get it, recompose, and now I can take a picture without the camera refocusing. Normally the camera would refocus, and that would be a pain. The beauty of back button focusing is that you focus once with the AF on button, you can reposition, don't need to hold on to the camera, don't need to press halfway down on the shutter release. You can take a photo, you can say, you know what, that was a terrible composition, let's make it better. Okay, that's much better. Now we can take another photo and it's still focused in the right spot. We can move it again and it's still focused in the right spot. And so back button focusing allows you to separate the focusing aspect and the taking picture aspect. And that just gives you a little bit more control. And so it's something that it takes a little while to get used to. I know when I first started doing it, it seemed a little bit weird, and it's absolutely the worst feature ever when you're going to hand your camera to somebody else to take a photo, because generally random people don't know about back button focusing. It's kind of a secret photography thing. So sometimes if I was going to hand my camera off to somebody else to shoot, I would take it out of back button focusing. But when I'm using it, that's my way that I like to use it. All right, a tool that you can use to help you achieve the correct focus when manual focusing is through focus peaking. And this is a feature that can be turned on in the autofocus menu. And what it does is it shows you areas that are in focus with this highlighted color. It's this kind of shimmering color around anything that is really contrasty and in focus. Now, this is the easiest way to see where the zone of focus is when you're looking at the entire frame. It is not the most accurate way of getting precise focus. That is either going to be either through magnification or through another system. The problem with this is that anything that's kind of close to being contrasty is going to shimmer, and that may or may not be in focus. But it is generally good to show you the zone of focus, and so you can get it pretty darn close to accurate very quickly using this system. When you dive into the autofocus menu, you'll see that there's a few different options. First up is you can turn the peaking on and off. Normally you're going to probably want to leave it off. If you do leave it on, you're only going to see it on when the camera goes into manual focus. So you could leave it on if you do like it all the time in manual focus. The effect can be turned on high or low, and you can choose different colors that are appropriate for the background and the subject so that you can see your subject quite easily. And so it's a good technique for certain situations. Another one that I really like on this camera is called Focus Assist. And this is, well, technically it's called a focus guide, but it's one of the assist ways that the camera can help you out. And this is how it shows you how to turn the lens to achieve sharpest focus. And so it has this clever arrow system that'll tell you whether you're near focused or far focused on your subject. So the way this actually looks in the camera is You'll turn it closer and closer, and when it turns green, you've nailed focus. You can go past if you want, and you also have the scale along the bottom, which is showing you where your focus point is. And so this is a really good system for nailing focus, provided that your subject has some sharp contrast to the subject itself so that you can focus on it. It's a very good technique for manual focusing. All right, finally, I want to talk about focus bracketing. These are for special situations where you need great depth of field, and the camera on its own with the smallest aperture doesn't achieve what you want it to achieve. And so this is sometimes common in landscape photography where you have flowers in the foreground and a big scenic in the background and you want it all in focus. It can also come into play with product photography or things in the studio where you have a subject and you're trying to get sharp focus from one edge to the other edge of it. And the camera will go through a series of shooting a number of photos. You take those photos into an external software program and then combine them, taking the sharpest portion of each of those images, and that becomes a final image where everything is in focus. So when you dive into focus bracketing, there will first be the option of turning it on and off. Normally it's left off. When you turn it on, you then need to decide how many shots you're going to need. And this number can go between 2 and 999, and it completely depends on what you're doing and how much depth of field it needs. And so this is something you try to keep with the lowest number possible, because then that's less images you need to process, but enough to make sure that you're going to get a sharpness that you need. The increment is how much the lens changes between each of the focusing images. And this one is once again going to be dependent on where your aperture is, how big the subject is, and the number of shots. This is one of those things that you need to experiment a little bit with to see what works for the type of photography that you're doing. Then you can also use exposure smoothing, which should generally only be necessary if you are using a macro lens focused up pretty close, because as the lens focuses, it changes exposure when it gets down to really high magnification ratios. So let's do a little example here, show you. So here we have 4 subjects. The first one is in focus, and it's relatively shallow depth of field because it's a pretty close-up shot. And so what we're going to do is we're going to shoot 12 images, and the camera is adjusting focus on each one of these images. And on the final image, we have our 4th subject in focus. We take those 12 images, we combine them into one image. I'm using a program called Helicon software. That's Helicon software. There are other programs out there. This one's easy and pretty affordable. And it combines all of those into one shot, and now I have all 4 of those subjects sharp in focus. And so there's a lot of different options and parameters when you're in the external software that we're not going to get into here. But having this being able to be done in camera has made this much easier to do when you're out in the field. And so having this, as I say, requires a little bit of setup and a few little tips for those of you who do want to get in here to do this. Because you're taking several photographs, your camera can't be moving around. And so this is non-moving subjects and your camera on a tripod. Manual exposure, because you want the exposure to be the same between all these images, because they're all going to be combined into one final image. I like apertures f8 to f11. You stop down too far, you start getting diffraction, but f8 and f11 still gives you a fair bit of depth of field so that you have some overlap so you don't have to shoot quite as many photos. You could shoot at f16 and you would need to shoot less of the shots. If you wanted to shoot at 5.6, you're going to have to use more of the shots. So it kind of depends on what workflow works best for you. But it's a great technique for getting infinite depth of field if you need that in a certain situation. So as you can see, there's a lot of great focusing options on the camera. I encourage you to experiment with these and find out what your new favorites are, because there's a lot of new options we haven't had on previous cameras.